They say dogs can sense danger hours before humans even know it's coming. But what they don't tell you is what happens when a single dog's instinct becomes the difference between life and death for complete strangers. This is the story of how a 7-year-old golden retriever named Ranger did something that even professional rescue teams said was impossible. Though this story occurs deep in Texas, heroism like this knows no borders. Tell us, where are you from? Please comment below. We want to hear, see, and know how far Ranger's impact stretches across the globe during the worst flash flood in Texas history. By the end of this story, you'll understand why Ranger's rescue method was so unique that it's now being studied by emergency responders across the country. The Gibson family had been coming to their cozy cabin along the Guadalupe River for 4th of July weekend for 8 years running. It was their sacred tradition. Just James, his wife Maria, their twin 7-year-old daughters Annabelle and Isabella, and James's elderly mother, Grandma Carmen. Their cabin sat peacefully among the cypress trees, close enough to the river that they could hear the gentle water lapping against the banks at night. This year they'd brought Ranger, a golden retriever they'd rescued just 6 months earlier. The big, gentle dog had quickly become the twins' shadow, following them everywhere with his tail wagging and those intelligent amber eyes that seemed to understand every word. James often joked that Ranger was more protective of the girls than he was. The dog would position himself between the children and any perceived danger, from strangers at the park to delivery trucks rumbling down their street. What James didn't know was that Ranger had been trained as a water rescue dog before his previous owners abandoned him. The skills hidden in Ranger's muscle memory would soon save 5 lives. But first, James was about to discover why his dog always positioned himself by windows during storms. That July 4th evening had been perfect. They'd grilled burgers, watched fireworks over the water, and fallen asleep to the sounds of crickets and the distant murmur of the river. Ranger, as always, had settled himself across the bedroom doorway where the twins slept, his favorite spot to keep watch. But that night, something in his training was telling him to stay alert, and what he sensed would change everything. At 3:30 a.m., Ranger began to pace because his water rescue training had taught him to recognize the sound of rapidly rising water, a skill his new family didn't know he possessed. James stirred as the dog's nails clicked frantically across the wooden floor, but it was Ranger's low, urgent whining that fully woke him. Outside, thunder rumbled and rain hammered the cabin roof, but something in Ranger's behavior sent a chill down James's spine. The dog was pawing at the front door, then racing to the window, then back to the door, his entire body trembling with anxiety. "What is it, boy?" James whispered, but when he looked outside, what he saw would force him to make an impossible choice in the next 60 seconds. James's blood turned to ice. The gentle river they'd fallen asleep to had erupted into a catastrophic flash flood. Cars were floating downstream like toys, their headlights cutting eerie paths through the churning water. In the distance, he could see the desperate beam of a flashlight cutting through the rain, someone across the river, frantically waving from high in a cypress tree. And the water. The water was rising so fast it seemed impossible. But the real horror was what Ranger could hear that human ears couldn't detect, and his reaction would shock everyone. The lights in their cabin suddenly flickered, then died completely, plunging them into darkness. The risk of electrocution from downed power lines now made every step outside a potential death sentence. That's when they heard it. Somewhere in the darkness, cutting through the storm, the terrified screams of children and adults desperately calling for help. James shook his family awake as Ranger's barking grew more insistent. "We need to get to higher ground, now!" But as they stumbled outside with their emergency flashlight, they realized the full, devastating scope of the catastrophe. The Guadalupe River had become a raging torrent of destruction, carrying away cars, entire mobile homes, kayaks, and massive tree limbs. The flash flood had turned their peaceful valley into a war zone. Everywhere James looked, families were evacuating, some climbing trees with whatever they could grab, others clinging to floating debris that could become their coffin at any moment. About 50 yards away, barely visible in the churning water, was a family desperately holding onto the roof of their SUV that was being swept downstream like a leaf. What this family was screaming would make Ranger's next decision even more incredible. "Help us!" came the desperate cry across the water. "We can't swim!" "Please." James's heart sank. Even if they could swim, which clearly they couldn't, it would be a death sentence in these conditions. People were being easily washed away by currents so powerful they could snap trees in half. Maria grabbed his arm as she frantically tried using her cell phone, sending texts to 911 to anyone who might coordinate search and rescue operations. But what she discovered about the rescue situation would make the next 60 seconds even more desperate. Maria's phone finally connected to emergency services. "Flash flood on the Guadalupe near mile marker 47, James shouted over the storm. "Family trapped. We need search and rescue immediately." The dispatcher's voice crackled back. "Sir, we have catastrophic flooding across 6 counties. Rescue operations are stretched beyond capacity. There are missing people everywhere. We'll get to you as soon as we can." Translation: they were completely on their own. That's when Ranger did something that defied every instinct of self-preservation. Around them, the catastrophic flood continued its rampage. Cars were stuck in trees 30 feet above the normal riverbank. Life vests and camping gear floated past like ghosts of interrupted vacations. This wasn't just a flood. It was nature erupting in its most devastating form. They were helpless, until Ranger made the decision for them. Without warning, the golden retriever plunged into the churning water, somehow understanding that these people couldn't save themselves. "Ranger, no!" Annabelle screamed, but the dog was already swimming with powerful strokes toward the stranded family, somehow knowing exactly how to navigate the deadly current. What happened next seemed impossible until you understand the secret of how water rescue dogs are trained to handle exactly this situation. James watched in amazement as Ranger fought against the current that was easily washing away everything in its path. Dogs can swim up to 3 times longer than humans before exhausting. Their natural buoyancy and paddle-like motion designed for exactly this kind of emergency. But Ranger was doing something even more remarkable than just swimming. What happened next seemed impossible. Ranger reached the SUV and began barking, not panic barking, but loud, commanding barks that carried over the storm. These were the specific rescue commands he'd been trained to give stranded victims. The family on the roof looked down at him in confusion until one of the children, a boy about Annabelle's age, suddenly understood something that would determine whether they all lived or died. The boy had a rope, probably from their camping gear. He tied one end around his waist and dropped into the water with Ranger, trusting a dog he'd never met with his life. James ran along the riverbank, following Ranger's progress as the dog gripped the boy's shirt collar in his powerful jaws and began the impossible journey back. But they weren't heading toward James. Ranger was using a technique called diagonal swimming, using the flood's own power to carry them toward a massive cypress tree whose roots created a small, sheltered area above the waterline. The first rescue took 12 agonizing minutes. Then Ranger did something that left everyone speechless. He swam back again and again. Each time, one family member at a time, the exhausted dog made the treacherous journey across the deadly river, past floating refrigerators, overturned boats, and debris that could crush him at any moment. But on his 4th trip, carrying the smallest child, something went terribly wrong. Meanwhile, James kept trying his cell phone, finally getting through to emergency services again. We have catastrophic flooding across 6 counties. Rescue operations are stretched beyond capacity. There are missing people everywhere. We'll get to you as soon as we can. On his 4th trip carrying the smallest child, a girl who couldn't have been more than 4, Ranger's strength finally began to fail. Around them, the devastating flood continued claiming victims. In the distance, James could see people still climbing trees, still calling for help that might never come. "He's not going to make it," Maria whispered, tears streaming down her face. But Ranger had one more miracle that would change everything. As he struggled against the current with the little girl, lights suddenly blazed through the rain. A Texas Parks and Wildlife rescue boat, equipped with proper life vests and emergency gear, came roaring around the bend. They'd been conducting search and rescue operations all night, following reports of missing people, but in the maze of debris and darkness, they might have missed this stranded family entirely. Instead, they followed the sound of Rangers barking like a beacon through the catastrophic flood. "Over here!" James shouted, waving his flashlight frantically. "Dog in the water with a child?" The rescue boat crew later said they'd never seen anything like it. And here's the incredible part. Ranger's barking wasn't random. His previous training had taught him specific sound patterns that rescue teams are trained to recognize. He had literally been calling for professional help in a language only emergency responders understand. When the sun rose over the devastated Guadalupe River Valley, the full scope of the catastrophic flood became clear. Search and rescue operations continued around the clock as teams in borrowed kayaks, helicopters, and swift water boats scoured miles of debris-filled waterways for missing people. Cars remained stuck in trees 40 feet above the normal water level, testament to the devastating power that had erupted from the earth overnight. The flash flood had taken at least 110 people across central Texas, with families still evacuating from areas where the risk of electrocution from downed power lines remained high. Rescue operations stretched from Kerr County to surrounding areas, with hundreds of people still unaccounted for. Emergency responders worked tirelessly, knowing that for many families clinging to trees or trapped in attics, every minute could mean the difference between life and death. But in one small corner of that tragedy, there was a different story. The Davis family, the strangers Ranger had saved, survived because of a dog who couldn't bear to hear children cry for help in a flood that had become a death sentence for so many others. All 5 family members made it to safety, with only minor injuries and a lifetime of gratitude to a golden retriever who understood what it meant to be a hero. The rescue boat crew that pulled them from the cypress tree told the Davis family something that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Without Ranger's specific rescue barking technique to guide them through the debris field, they would have passed right by in the darkness. The dog hadn't just saved 5 lives, he had led professional rescuers to them when their own cell phone texts and calls couldn't get through. James found Ranger later that morning, exhausted but proud, gently licking the twins' faces as they whispered, "Good boy," over and over into his wet fur. Around them, the devastating aftermath of the flash flood stretched for miles, but the dog who had been a rescue himself had become a rescuer, proving once again that sometimes the most extraordinary heroes come on 4 legs with wagging tails, hidden training, and hearts bigger than we ever imagined possible. But here's what's really incredible. This wasn't the only dog who performed miraculous rescues during the Texas floods. Emergency responders are now studying these cases to understand how animals with hidden training might be integrated into official disaster response protocols. Stories like Ranger's remind us that in our darkest moments, hope often comes from the most unexpected places. Dogs don't just give us unconditional love. They show us what unconditional courage looks like, especially when they carry skills we never knew they possessed. Ranger didn't know he was a hero. He didn't care about the headlines or the praise. He just heard someone cry for help and did what his heart told him to do. That night, a dog who had once been abandoned gave 5 strangers the greatest gift of all, their lives. And maybe that's what makes dogs so extraordinary. They don't just live with us, they save us in ways we never expect. If stories like Ranger's remind you of the goodness still in this world, join us here, because we share them every day. In honor of Ranger, please subscribe to our channel and let's keep celebrating these unsung heroes together.